Hello there, I'm John Rollison, and welcome to Hell. Welcome to lesson 3 of I'm not sure how many lessons of our online Bible study webinar / podcast on the study of hell. It's a subject that a lot of people think about, and certainly there's some stuff written about it, so it's worth studying. I am the pastor at Journey of Life Lutheran Church in Orlando, Florida. If you want to connect with us, our website is journeyoflife.org. We have a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/JOL Church. And there is a specific playlist, if you go there, for Bible study videos. It's called Dig Deeper. We're not a huge YouTube channel, but we do have over 26,000 lifetime views. So that's something. We must be doing something worth watching. And then we also have an audio podcast version of just about everything. The link is on the screen, or you can just go to archive.org and search for Journey of Life Lutheran Church. And the very first thing will be our collection of audio there. And mostly that will be sermon podcasts and Bible study podcasts, along with a few other things. So let's review the first 2 lessons before we get to our lesson today. If you haven't listen to those other lessons, they kind of build on each other, although each of these 3 lessons do kind of stand alone. But I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel or our archive.org page and listen to the first 2 first, just to sort of keep things going in proper order. So lesson 1, what we did was we kind of surveyed theological views of hell throughout the ages and found out that there's quite a variety of views of hell throughout the ages, and that our modern sort of evangelical Protestant way of looking at hell is not definitely not the only way of looking at the doctrine of hell throughout history, even by other mainstream kind of theologians. Then last week on our second lesson, we looked at the Old Testament word Sheol. That's a Hebrew word, and it means the place of the dead. It's used in a punishment sense kind of sometimes, but it's really that someone's going to get sent to Sheol early, really. It's just where everybody goes. Then in the intertestamental period, there is a book called Enoch. And in that book, there's a vision of Sheol described where there's actually 2 different places in Sheol. And there's a place where people are in torment and a place where people are at peace. And there's a great chasm fixed between them. And that is a picture that Jesus also uses in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today. So that's our review, and on with our lesson. There are 3 words in the New Testament for hell. And now this doesn't count different ways of describing hell. We're going to go back to other figures of speech and things like that, but we're starting with the words that actually get translated as hell or similar, depending on which Bible version you use. Some Bible versions choose to leave Hades and Gehenna in their word form. So the actual English Bible says blah, blah, blah Hades or blah, blah, blah Gehenna, which I kind of like because it gives you more information. On the other hand, you have to go look up words you don't know, right? So 3 words, and this is what we're going to spend our time on together today: Hades, Tartarus, and Gehenna. Of those, Hades, everybody's heard that one. Hotter than Hades, right? And Tartarus, almost no one's heard of. And Gehenna is one that is fairly well known in Christian circles. I don't know what circles you travel in or read in. So anyway, those are the 3 words we're going to look at together today. Words in the New Testament written in Greek. And these are words that are translated as kind of hell or the place of the dead or equivalent like that. So first of all, Hades. That's a Greek word. It is essentially the New Testament, the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Sheol. Now, there are a few places where it is used opposite heaven to indicate kind of a place of judgment, like will you go up to heaven? No, you will go down to Sheol, for instance. So Hades is, as I said, it's basically the place of departed spirits, and in most senses it's neutral. I've pulled information from several different Bible dictionaries to bring to you. And so first we're going to look at some information that comes from Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary of the Old and New Testament Words. So Hades, region of the spirits of the dead or lost, including the spirits of those who die destined for heaven, but precede the ascension of Jesus in the timeline of the theology of the compilers of this particular dictionary. We're going to talk about who's where, when, timeline-wise in another episode or lesson, so we're not going to do that today. But the etymology of the word Hades is kind of interesting, I think. Some people say it comes from a word that means the unseen, like it's the unseen place. But the writers of this dictionary think it probably comes from another word, Hado, which signifies all receiving. And we saw that last week with Sheol, with verses like Sheol has a wide mouth and nobody, and eats everybody, which, is a thoroughly depressing poetic way of saying we're all going to die, right? So Sheol, Hades. Just like Sheol doesn't denote the physical grave, and Hades doesn't either. It's the place of the lost. And in some timelines, it's seen as the place, well, not just the lost, everybody, but in some timelines, it's seen as the place, kind of the holding tank until the final judgment, where people are destined either for heaven or for Gehenna, which is a word we're going to get to in a minute. So Hades, the word is used 4 times in the Gospels, and it's always used by Jesus. We'll look at a couple Bible verses here showing that Jesus says he's the one who has the keys to it. In fact, at one point, Hades is even personified, sort of given a personality, and it can be picked up and thrown into the lake of fire. So let's look at these verses. Matthew 11, verse 21 is that distinction that I talked about in the beginning about Hades being the opposite of heaven, which is kind of unusual. That's not the way it's normally used. But Jesus is speaking, and he says, "You, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained unto this day." And so there, Hades does really kind of seem like the place of punishment, but that's kind of unusual there. And that's what we're gonna find a couple of different instances here, and it gets a little frustrating because what you and I think most of us anyways would like is a textbook, and it doesn't really work that way. Life, in fact, doesn't work that way. Your relationships with your spouse and your kids and your parents, the textbooks guide you, but they are not math. And so here we are not going to get a mathematically precise definition of Hades and a mathematically precise timeline of anything, just things to think about and ways to look at stuff. Matthew 16, verse 16, Peter has just, Jesus asked Peter who other people say he is, and some say Elijah, some say the prophet, etc. And then he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus responds, "I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock," that is the confession that Jesus is the Christ, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And so some people look at this and say, oh, hell has gates, and they start trying to think about what kind of gates hell might have, what kind of gates Hades might have, and I don't think that's what's going on here. Hades is a place that is destined to be conquered. That's what's really going on here. Hades is a place that's destined to be conquered, and it is the church's job to conquer it. And we're the church is supposed to be active going out in the name of Christ, because gates are stationary, right? So if you're going to break gates, you got to go up against them. In this next Bible verse is from Acts 2, verse 27, in which Peter, it's his big sermon at Pentecost, and he's talking about Jesus, who was raised from the dead, and he quotes Psalm 16:9 as a prophecy about Jesus. And this is what it says: "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades. which would be Sheol in the Old Testament, or let your Holy One see corruption. So he's not dead long enough for his body to begin to corrupt, kind of thing like that. So there it is the place, and we're going to, in a later lesson, we're going to talk about, in one of the books of the Bible, it says Jesus went to proclaim to the souls in prison. And we're going to look at what that might mean too, in terms of the souls in prison, since this is a Bible study on hell. But here it's a place that can't hold Jesus. Revelation 1, verse 17 to 18 says this. Revelation, if you remember, it is a vision given to John the Apostle. And so a lot of the language is figurative and things like that. And so you got to be careful. There's a lot of the Bible you don't have to be careful, like be afraid of it, but be careful about the way you interpret it, because it's got dreams and visions and poetry and apocalyptic writing, which is kind of code language. There's just a lot of different stuff to take into account in trying to figure out what it's really saying. And so you want to just kind of be careful. Revelations 1:17 to 18. John writes, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades.'" And that's Jesus talking, by the way. He says, "I have the keys of death and Hades." Death there is Thanatos, which I think there is a Marvel, one of the big Marvel villains is Thanos, which is a reference to death. It's Greek. So, but here Jesus says he has the keys to these things, which means he controls them. They don't control him, and he can open them up for people. Revelation 6, verse 8, looking a little further ahead, John writes, "I looked, and behold, I saw a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death." Again, that's Thanatos. "And Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth." So there, Hades is kind of, like I said, is personified. It's actually, Hades is the gaping jaws of the underworld, the place of the dead, and it's following the pale horse, whose name is Death. And by the way, it's interesting, I just found this out today when we were in our Wednesday morning Bible study studying this, that that's actually a pale green gray. And when I read that, I thought, now that's more like a death horse. I mean, pale horses can be quite pretty, but pale green gray, now that doesn't sound pretty at all. And so Jesus has these keys and can let, oh, I'm thinking of the other Bible verse. So death and Hades followed, and it's like swallowing everybody up, right? Revelation 20, verse 13. This is a little interesting. It says, and this is at the end, the final judgment, when everybody's called out of the grave. "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they'd done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire." And we're going to get to that in a minute, because that's Gehenna. But so here we have death and Hades as places, or almost personified again, willing to give up the things that are in them. And it's interesting here, and I didn't get a chance to study this, but it says the sea gave up the dead who were in it. So it's almost like Hades, which remember is Shalom from before that. It's just the place of the dead, and the dead people go down. And I'm wondering if, like, people who die on the earth are seen to go down in the earth, and people who die in the sea are seen to go down in the sea. And so if you die in the sea, you go to like the place of the dead in the sea, not to Sheol. I'd have to look it up more, but it's interesting. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. So that's pretty much Hades, the place of the dead. Then the next word takes only a moment. Tartarus is the word. It's in the New Testament. This is a word they borrowed from Greek mythology, and it refers to a place of punishment for the most wicked. And Peter uses this word in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. And then he goes on something else. But this is the passage, this is a little piece we're concerned with. Cast them into hell. The word behind hell in this instance, and by the way, I'm using the English Standard Version for this whole thing. The word behind hell here is tartarus, which Peter must have chosen because it's this word for the punishment of really, really wicked beings. And that's where God has put the angels in Peter's view. Now we get to Gehenna, hell, hellfire. So the word Gehenna is derived from the Hebrew word Gehinnom, which means the valley of Hinnom. It's also sometimes referred to in the Old Testament as the valley of the sons of Hinnom. It's located west and south of Jerusalem, and it's just like right outside the city kind of thing, and it kind of runs on. It's a valley that runs out the southwest of Jerusalem and down into the Kidron Valley, opposite the modern village of Silwan, since we all know where that is. So the Valley of Hinnom once formed part of the border between the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So this Valley of Hinnom, here's what happened. During the monarchical period, and what that is the period of the kings. So in around 1000, I'm trying to remember, it's either 1050 or 1080, depending on who dates it or whatever. But so you got King Saul, and then he didn't turn out to be a good king. So then there was King David and King Solomon. That's when Israel, the nation of Israel is united. And after that, I think it ended in 930, if my memory serves me correct. And after that, there were two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was Israel, and the southern kingdom was Judah. So if you're reading the Old Testament, you really have to be aware of what time is being referred to and what you're writing, so that you know what Judah and Israel are in terms of the northern and southern kingdom, or the whole kingdom. And so here's the thing. Israel never had, the kingdom of Israel, after the breakup, the northern kingdom, never had a single good king. The kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, after the breakup, had bad kings and good kings. More bad than good, but had a few good kings in there. So during this time, and especially the later time, the Valley of Hinnom became a high place. It was called Topheth, was one of the names for it, and that's derived from an Aramaic word meaning fireplace, where kings of Judah engaged in forbidden religious practices, including human sacrifice by fire. And so I'm going to read you just a couple of Bible passages that go with that. So this is 2 Chronicles 28, 1 verse 4. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. Pause here for a moment. Notice the use of the word father there is for ancestor. Ahaz was not David's son directly. There are generations between them. But he refers to his father David because he's in the ancestral line. Okay, we'll continue on now. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. So Ahaz is Judah, but he walks in the ways of the kings of Israel, which is the northern kingdom. So that means he's obviously walking in a bad way because he's the king of Judah. He even made metal images for the Baals, and he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. So Ahaz just adopted all the religious practices of the people that God was trying to get rid of. God was trying to get rid of child sacrifice and things like that. And they had various ways of doing it. One was a particular god who was made out of metal, and he had a place in his feet to light a fire. And so you'd light a fire and get this thing really, really hot. The whole statue is really hot, like glowing. And then they would place the babies on the hands would be extended out in front, like like you were holding a child kind of thing, only they'd be glowing hot, and then you would place the baby on the arms of the glowing metal god. It's horrible. Jeremiah 7, verse 31. It's the same thing, these kind of verses I'm reading for you now. For the sons of Judah have done evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house that is called by my name to defile it. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in fire, which I did not command, nor did it even come into my mind. So because of this kind of practice, Jeremiah prophesied about the impending judgment and destruction of the kingdom. King Josiah, one of the good kings, put an end to the practices by destroying and defiling the high place, that Topheth in the valley of Hinnom. Now, probably because of these associations with fiery destruction and judgment, the word Gehenna came to be used metaphorically during the intertestamental period. That's the period between Malachi around 400 BC and the birth of Christ. Gehenna, Hinnom Valley, became kind of seems to have slid into a designation for hell or eternal damnation. In the New Testament, it's only used for hell, and it's never referred to. That Gehenna is not a geographic place. You can't walk to Gehenna in the way the New Testament uses it. And so Gehenna has to be distinguished from Hades, which is either the abode of the dead in general or the place where wicked await final judgment, depending on how you pick those things apart, which we'll continue to do and hopefully arrive at some clarity, or at least a place of peace with what we know and don't know by the end of our study. By contrast, the righteous enter paradise, or a state of bliss, immediately upon death, but then we're trying to sort of put an earthly timeline on unearthly existences, and that's always a little bit dangerous. So, but there, just bear in mind again that Gehenna is this fire torture place, and Sheol / Hades is sort of more generically the place of the dead. Paradise is a state of bliss, and so that's not actually what we're studying, but I'm sure it'll come up again in a little bit. So you remember, for instance, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. We've talked about it before. There was a poor man who sat at the gate of a rich man's house and wished he could eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table, but he couldn't. He wouldn't even have those. And the dogs licked Lazarus' sore. They both died, and they ended up. The rich man was in torment, and Lazarus was at Abraham's side being comforted, and there was a big chasm fixed between them. Now, some people think that the good side is in Sheol, but it's the side of peace, and that might be paradise. That might be what the word paradise is used for, the side of the place of the dead, which is the place of peace and comfort. And then the rich man is in not in Gehenna, but in torment in Hades. So you could see that great divide as the divide between heaven and hell in this story, or you could see it as a divide in Hades, the place of the dead, where some people are at peace, and that's paradise, and other people are in torment. The thief on the cross was talking to Jesus, and in Luke 23, verse 42 to 43, we have this recorded. The thief said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So where is paradise? Is that like the heavenly realm forever, or is that the comforting and peaceful side of Hades, where people wait the final judgment? You know, we're going to try and tease that out. Probably got at least 2 or 3 more weeks of this. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 3 to 4. Paul's writing, and he says, "I know that this man was caught up into the paradise, whether in the body or out, I don't know, God knows. But he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter." So somebody in a vision or whatever visited paradise, but they have a word for heaven, and paradise is different, and we're going to explore that a little bit. But remember, we're trying to explore hell, not heaven and paradise. I think we're going to end up going there because they go together so tightly. So Jesus, when he was speaking, warned of committing sins that would lead to gehenna. Matthew 5 verse 22 says, I say to you, everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. And the hell of fire is Gehenna. Again, Matthew 5:29-30. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. Again, that's Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. Gehenna. Mark 9, verses 42-48. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And then we get this other part here. It's a repeat of before. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life, short for eternal life, cripple then with 2 hands to go to hell, to unquenchable fire. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life lame with 2 feet than to be thrown with 2 feet into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. And that last part there about the worm and the fire is a quote from the Old Testament. So Jesus lays it out straight. Now remember the Hebrew penchant for hyperbole. Jesus talked about having someone else having a speck in their own eye and a plank in your own eye. And so he's not really necessarily suggesting that people dismember themselves. And we also actually know from history that dismembering yourself doesn't necessarily change your heart. There have been some very famous early Christians, and I wish I could remember which one, but I can't. But one of them really wanted to stop sinning, so they castrated themselves. And what happened was the mental condition of that level of desire stayed with him, and he just lacked the means to do anything. So I guess in that way it kept him from sinning, but it didn't change what was going on in his head. Luke 12, verse 5, Jesus tells us to remember there's somebody who has authority to cast us into Gehenna. He says, I warn you whom to fear. And the previous verse before this says, don't fear the one who only has the authority to kill the body. Fear the one who, after you are killed, has the authority to cast you into Gehenna. Yes, fear him. Okay, if you heard my voice change there for a little bit, it's because I got a horrible cramp in my foot and I had to go take care of it. But the cramp is gone and I am back. So, in the New Testament, Gehenna designates a place or a state which appears to be the final punishment of the wicked. And it's described as at least 3 different things. One is like a fiery furnace. Jesus said in Matthew 13, verses 41-42, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's also called an unquenchable fire. Mark 9, verse 43, we already read this. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better to enter life crippled than with 2 hands go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. Or an eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew 25, verse 41. Jesus is telling us a parable about people and the sheep and the goats, and some people depart into the eternal dwellings prepared for them, and other people depart well, Matthew 25 verse 41 says, he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, I would like to point out, because we've come across this unquenchable and eternal thing a couple times, just because the fire is unquenchable doesn't mean that the people, the souls thrown into it, exist in there forever. And so some would say they're thrown into that unquenchable fire and it's annihilation. Others would say they're thrown in there and they suffer forever. There might even be some who say they're thrown in there until whatever corrective punishment has taken place and they're fit for the kingdom. But we're going to keep exploring that together. The focus of last lesson and this lesson is just to kind of get those words under our belt and get the range of usage of these words comfortable in our mind. Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, we don't really have to worry about that, and Gehenna. So just to close off, I got a little bit from another Bible dictionary. This one's the LEXHAM Bible Dictionary, and it's talking about the intertestamental period, and that's the period of time. The last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, written about 400 BC, and then there's 400 years of silence, and then there's Jesus. So now there's just because nothing was adopted for the Hebrew Scriptures after Malachi doesn't mean there was nothing written. So the theme of the accursed valley is resumed and developed in the other extra biblical literature. Even though it's still sort of a localized place of judgment, it begins to have, instead of being called the accursed valley, it starts to be referred to as Gehenna. And it begins to be associated with the judgment that Jeremiah was talking about. And in fact, the one that Jesus quoted also, where their worm will not die and their fire not be quenched. Isaiah 66, verse 24. They shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against them. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. So the bodies are dead. So the worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched. I'm not sure how that works out with dead bodies. Is this annihilation or what? Or just sort of an ugly picture of what happens to those who rebel? Not sure. So these two symbols, the valley of Hinnom, and the unquenchable fire, don't refer to each other directly, but they begin to be associated with each other. And by the time you get to the New Testament, the Gehenna valley and the unquenchable fire seem to be used interchangeably as metaphors for the final destruction or punishment, depending on your view of the wicked. The angels are thrown in there, and the other rebellious people are thrown in there. And then we saw in Revelation, death and Hades are even thrown into Gehenna. So now, the last thing, just to close off with this, and this is something I learned, and I verified this with a few other sources too. There is it's the Christian version of an urban legend, and it is the idea that there's a big pile of garbage constantly burning outside the city, and that's where Gehenna was, the Valley of Hinnom, that's out the southwest of Jerusalem. That the refuse was all out there, and bodies of animals and all sorts of things, and it was just a constantly burning fire. And I think I've probably even said that in sermons. And upon research and reading other people who've done more research than me, it appears that this was never said anywhere at any time or referenced anywhere until a rabbi in the Middle Ages at about 1200 AD had this said this thing about the garbage heap outside Jerusalem. So it seems pretty likely that there was no garbage heap outside Jerusalem constantly burning. And another thing like that I probably have used in a sermon that turns out to be the Christian version of an urban legend is the idea that the high priest, when he goes into the Holy of Holies once a year, would have a rope tied around his ankle in case he died in there, and they could pull his body out without going into the Holy of Holies. That, again, there's no reference to that until we get to the Middle Ages, around 1200. So, these things, they're kind of fun, right? It's interesting that both of those, the burning pile of trash and bodies and the idea of the cord around the high priest's ankle have both really taken root in Christian circles and have been published and everything, and yet the research on them can't document them anywhere earlier than some guy in 1200 AD. So that is our study. That's our end of lesson 3 on hell. And we have looked today at 3 different words. Hades, which is essentially the place of the dead, although seems to sort of connote punishment, especially once that divide is there. And it may be that there's a abode of the dead, and Hades is as the thought of Hades developed in the New Testament and through the intertestamental period and into the New Testament, it may be that as the place of the dead developed thought-wise, that Hades came to designate the place of punishment in the place of the dead, and paradise is the place of peace and release in the place of the dead. So, that Hades thing. Tartarus, used once, borrowed from Greek mythology for the place where really bad people go. And Gehenna, which is what we've been talking about now. So, again, I'm John Rollison. This has been an online Bible study webinar or podcast, depending on how you're listening to it. Our website is journeyoflife.org. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/JOL Church. The link to our podcast site is on the screen there if you're watching. It's archive.org, and just search for Journey of Life Lutheran Church. Visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/JOL Orlando. And if you are so inclined to support our ministry, you could do that at journeyoflife.org/donate. And if you've made it with me this far, thank you for listening. God bless you, and I will see you next time for lesson 4 of Who Knows How Many about Hell.